parents. You are the advocate for your child. It doesn't feel like it when you're first diagnosed, but you will become an expert in your child's condition, and you will absolutely end up knowing more about their condition than many of the doctors and nurses you meet, especially when you go to ED, the emergency department, or to your GP. You will know more, and that will be a very quick, steep learning curve. What can you do as a parent to start advocating for your child? Get to know the people who make the decisions about your healthcare. Get to know your haemophilia nurses, your consultant. You know, the haemophilia nurses are an easy way to access the service. You can contact them at any point during the working day, and they can be a nice, easy way in. I've just got this thought, what will the doctor think? Use your nurses as the first port of call. Gather information from the society, from the internet, from other parents. It's important to know what options there are for you and for your child. Communicate with us. We can only help you if we know what you want us to do. Each child will have their own strengths and weaknesses, and that can impact on their ability to accept and have treatment. Share them with us so we know what works for your child and what doesn't. There is a much bigger picture, and I think it's already been said. Treatment has got to fit into your life and not rule it. We always say, do your prophylaxis in the morning before school. It doesn't work for every family. Talk to us. You know, we've got a family with 3 boys with severe haemophilia. Before they swapped to Hemlibra, they were all on alternate day factor 8. How that mum did it and got all 3 to school. I've only got 1 to get to school or college now, and it's bad enough. Never mind 3. So what we want as healthcare professionals doesn't always fit into family life. Talk to us. We'll come up with a plan. So when you go to clinic appointments, at the moment for us at Birmingham, it is 1 parent only. But if you ask, we'll let 2 in. It's worth asking. It's really overwhelming when you're first diagnosed. You know, you might have come through the child protection route, which is traumatic in itself. You've suddenly realised that these bruises that you've seen actually have a cause, and it's not going to go away. Write down your questions before you come. Never be afraid to ask a question. Nothing stupid. We've heard it before, we'll hear it again. Please ask those questions. And like I say, be honest with us. We can only come up with the best treatment option for your child if we know what your child wants to do or to achieve. We've got boys with severe haemophilia A who play competitive football. They've come to us, they've been honest with what they want to do, and they have a daily treatment regime that allows them to do that. If we don't know, we can't help you. Please let us know what your child wants to achieve, and we will come up, as long as it's doable, we will come up with the best treatment plan. Just don't ask us to play contact rugby, because that will always be a no. If you can only get 1 parent in or your other parent can't attend, ask if you can voice record the appointment just on your phone so that you can listen back to it and the other parent can hear what's been said. So just simple things that at the beginning of your journey can help. Now, obviously I'm in paediatrics, and the beginning of the journey might be as a parent of a baby, but we've just had twins of 15 diagnosed with mild haemophilia. So I've now got 2 teenagers and a mum who turns out to be an obligate carrier, who's always been told, oh no, it doesn't matter. Unfortunately, even at our own hospital, under surgeons, she's been told it doesn't matter. So no hospital is perfect. But I've now got her 3 sisters and all her family to support. So this journey can happen, you know, as a parent of a little one, as a parent of a teenager, or just as a parent yourself. You're then diagnosed on the back of your child, and you've got to start the journey. So all of this will apply to you at whatever stage you're diagnosed, and start your journey. You'll hear lots of terminology, and to a mom or some of the young adults here and adults with haemophilia, you'll know what all these things mean. But when you first start your journey, we talk a foreign language. And it's really important that you ask us to explain what some of these terminologies mean, because they're an important part of your child's journey, and you will encounter most of them at some point. So it's important you understand what we're talking about and what this means. So treatment products, again, a lot of you will know this, but for new families, what does recombinant mean? It's a strange word. They've all heard of plasma-derived as a concept, but what does that mean? Contaminated blood, is that going to affect my child? Hemlibra, then there's for the children with bleeding disorders that affect platelets or factor V, they have to have blood products. And along with that goes certain risks and benefits. And then the use of good old tranexamic acid, what does that do? Why does it work? And it's explaining to families why it works and why it's so important to take it regularly on the back of your factor as well. So it's explaining to families what all these things mean. And again, we talk about prophylaxis and on-demand. What does that mean? So it's families understanding that, you know, we've got a few mild and moderate haemophilia boys who have had a random one-off bleed. We've scanned them and they've got some joint damage. They're starting prophylaxis at 11 and 15. And it's new to them. They've grown up without any problems. And all of a sudden, we're throwing at them needles twice a week. So it's explaining to them why all of a sudden they're at the point that they need treatment and that their sibling who's got haemophilia doesn't. You know, on demand, again, parents understanding that we will treat the children with mild and moderate haemophilia on the whole when they're injured, and it will be for as many doses as is required, and then it stops. And we're finding now that the younger boys with moderate haemophilia are being offered prophylaxis from a young age, and we've got a few taking it up, but not many. But I think going forward, prophylaxis for moderate haemophilias will become more the norm. We talk about having treatment, and again, what does that mean? So, good old-fashioned butterflies. There's also the concept of a vascuport. What does that mean? What's the advantages of that? What's the benefits? What's the risks? And a central line. Again, not everything is suitable for everybody. And a bit of Haemophilia in your tummy. So, not everything is suitable for every child. Obviously, some of it is diagnosis dependent. Not every route of administration suits all children and families. You know, we don't routinely at Birmingham put vascuports in our children. We aim to teach peripheral venipuncture. But some families, actually, we would prefer a port because it's easier. We live a long way away. Our shared care can't do venipuncture very well. We'll put a port in. So it's about knowing that these options exist and you don't have to just do the standard. Life situations can change. Your children's activity can change. So what you're doing now may not be appropriate in 6 weeks' time, 6 months' time. Talk to us. We can look at other options. We've got quite a few children at severe A's who've swapped to Hemlibra, and we've had a couple of teenagers that hated the injections so much they've gone back to factor VIII. Not a problem. It's about choice. Talk to us though, because we can assume that Hemlibra gives you a better quality of life, it's less needles, but actually it hurts at the end of the day, and it might be that intravenous factor VIII twice a week is better than a subcut injection. So we don't always go with what the healthcare professionals assume. Tell us it's not working. Can we discuss something else? So that's all I've got to say. The main thing is just talk to us. We're not scary on the whole, I don't think. We've heard questions before, nothing stupid. And, you know, when I get a child diagnosed with a bleeding disorder, I've also got a family to care for. And within paediatrics, it isn't just about the child, it's about their family, their siblings. We test as many extended family members as we need to get diagnosis for families. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Yeah, oh, hello. Yeah, I've got a loud voice. So, yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about shared decision making. I was recently involved in a project with Takeda to produce a shared decision aid. And I took the approach of, I've always spoken to my mum, my loved ones, my consultant, my team, and I just assumed that was just the norm. You speak, you communicate, you share a problem, the problem's halved, etc., etc. And on this project, I quickly realised that that's not the norm, or not the norm, but that doesn't happen as often as I thought it did. So just talking a little bit about my experience, 3 years ago maybe 4 years ago, I moved from a SHL to an EHL, so from a standard half-life to an extended half-life. My centre director is a very key advocate for Emmy, but through shared decision making, I've pretty much said, I want you to tailor my needs rather than your research. And I think by me saying that, him and his team, Steve Austin, respect my views, and at the end of the day, he wants the best for me. So although he does like putting his patients onto ME, it's a preference of his. If you meet certain criteria, he at the end of the day, him and his team want what's best for you. So I'd definitely encourage to start having conversations. Literally, as Natalie's just said, speak to the team, and a shared problem is a hard problem. But yeah, moving on to some other topics. So I briefly mentioned about my medicine choice. I think it's such a great thing being able to talk and sharing your issues or your queries that you might have. Don't ever feel that you're a burden to them. Like they're there to look after you, and if you don't tell them what's wrong, how are they meant to mind read? Like, they're doctors at the end of the day. They're trained to help you, to give you medication, to give you the best thing possible to live a normal life as such, quote unquote. But if you don't tell them, then they're not going to know. So that's my main key theme. Additionally, with like shared decision making, I think it also extends to your family and your loved ones. So at the end of the day, you are, well, as a patient, I'm the one living with a bleeding disorder, but my family have lived with me. They've basically been a big part of living with a bleeding disorder, although they don't have the condition as such. They've essentially psychologically seen the impact of me having haemophilia, or having twins with haemophilia. They've had 2 with the price of 1. Yeah, and I think definitely speaking definitely helps. I'm not saying that's just for making decisions, but just generally, if you communicate and you get things off your chest, then you'll live a lot happier. Or I think so anyway. But anyway, so when I did move on to my extended half-life, my 2 main themes were ease of use and suitability for my lifestyle. So my lifestyle has been very active growing up. I've never let the condition as such, haemophilia, get in the way. So growing up, I've played football, I've swum, I've played water polo. Unofficially, I've been a wrestler, fighting with my brothers growing up. And yes, end of the day, I'm very active, and I want to control my condition that suits me best. Hence my reasoning personally for not going on to ME. I just can't get around my head having one treatment every other week and knowing you're going to be fine. So I, for that reason, stayed on EHL, Alocta, and the team at St George's are very clear on my positioning on that. But yeah, moving on to lifestyle. I've always lived by the motto of do what you want until you get into trouble, then reassess. And it's kept me out of trouble. But I haven't done what I've wanted, literal. I've always said, this is what I'm going to do. This is why I want to do it. Have you got any issues? Do you have any recommendations, tweaks, etc.? And just by doing that, I think not only in the medical world, but in the working world, the corporate world, or friendships, if you speak out, then people know where you're coming from, why you're coming from, the reasoning behind why you're saying things that you do. And yeah, I think at the end of the day, when it comes to your condition, and if you want to change, you should be selfish and not be afraid of giving your own true opinions to your team as such. And finally, the wider care, I think that's really important. Having a bleeding disorder doesn't mean we just need to focus on your medical treatment. I think a lot of people overlook the additional things such as dentistry, psychology, physiotherapy, and yeah, speaking about physiotherapy, my physio Claire at St George's, we've got a great relationship. That said, I don't have much, what's the word? I don't have a lot of interaction with her in terms of face-to-face contact, simply because I'm someone, if I've got something that crops in my brain, I'm not going to wait 6 months to discuss something. I'll literally pick up the phone and say, Claire, got a little twinge here. Have you got any suggestions? And having that open conversation, honest conversation, just allows for things to just happen a lot quicker than those if you were someone who had thought, right, I'm going to wait 6 months for my next consultation, not say anything, write it down and wait 6 months. But by then, you've probably, if you're like myself, living an active lifestyle, you've got a little ankle bleed, acute bleed, and you play sports on that for 6 months whilst waiting, you're going to be in trouble down the line. So I think just always speak, always communicate what's on your mind, and be selfish. Do what's right for you. Yeah, and that's literally my talk done. So yeah, and yeah, moving on.
Thank you, Josh. We're about 7 minutes early to moving on to the next portion, so I'm going to fire a couple of questions at you for now to hopefully take us to about 10:02. My first one is for you, Josh, and then my second one is for you, Natalie. Josh, you've talked about shared decision-making and how you arrived at where you are now in terms of being on an extended half-life product rather than subcutaneous emicizumab, for example. Who was the driver of that change? Was it you who went to your doctor? Was it a doctor who came to you? Or
going from standard half to extended?
Yes. Who was the driver behind that?
I would say probably me, but in the sense that I was complaining a lot at home. I was like, oh, why am I doing injections every other day? I don't have time. I want to be playing when I'm not at school, playing in the garden, doing sports. And my mum, credit to her, gave me a lot of tough love growing up. So she's like, if you want to do something about it, do something about it. And at the time, I think I was 15 or 16, I moved over to the adult care because my nurse, as it were, was giving up, and staying in paediatrics didn't make sense for a year to then move again. So I moved quite young, and I always remember the first time I met Steve, my consultant, gave me tough love and said, if you're not going to speak out when you've got issues, you're going to live a very painful life. And I left that room thinking, what a... to this day, though, I've never had an issue with him. And yeah, so that first conversation stuck with me, and it's made me always... if I want to change something, I'll do something about it. So going back to your question, in short, me. Yeah.
What did that conversation look like? And by that I mean, did you go to your doctor and say, Steve, I'm having difficulty in my current regime, what else can we do? Or was it a case of, I've heard about Eloxer, I've heard about extended half-life, and I'd really like to try it and give it a go? What was the conversation that you had?
So I did a little bit of research into EHL, extended half-life. I'm quite open, so it was literally a conversation in my consultation, and I said to him, I've heard of EHL, I hear there's less injections, less needle bearing, what are the options? And he sat down, talked me through, and he said, we're not making a decision today, you're going to take all this information, leave, sleep on it, and call me in a week's time. And I went back 2 months, maybe a month later, and we started all like the PEK studies, all that stuff to move over. And it was like, when I said I'm interested in this, it was a pretty quick process because I think he appreciated that I'd wanted to change. I'd started a conversation, and him and his team were like, right, let's sort you out.
If you'd not done that research, And if you'd not had that conversation, how do you think your life would have been different?
How long is a piece of string? I could still be on SHL. I haven't had so I'm a severe haemophilia A patient, and I haven't had a spontaneous bleed since 2012, so quite a while. My bleeds come through trauma, sports, etc. And I'm quite strict to my regime, so I think if I hadn't done that research, even if I hadn't said anything, I probably still would be on SHL, because although I didn't really like injecting every other day, unless it was through trauma, I wasn't having bleeds. So it wasn't broken. So a lot of people would think, why are you trying to fix it? And yeah, so I think had I not done that, maybe I would still be on SHL. But I also would give credit to, I'm lucky I've grown up with a twin who's got the exact same thing. So it's not like I've been on my own. So we've naturally just spoken always about our issues. And yeah, one of those issues was needles for me growing up. So I was like, let's do something about it. So did some research, and then here I am on Elocta.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I think it's a great example of self-advocacy in progress. We've got a couple of minutes left, and Natalie, I've got a question for you. We've talked very much about newly diagnosed, but I'm interested to hear your experience about adolescent care. And I know we've been talking about boys with haemophilia, and obviously as a boy myself with haemophilia, I appreciate that we can be grumpy teenagers at times and not really talk. And I was fascinated a couple of years ago when I was speaking on a panel in Macedonia with the chair of the Finnish Haemophilia Society, who has a son with haemophilia. And she said, I think when he got to around the age of 9 or 10, although she went to the appointments with him, he went in first on his own. And I'm just wondering if that's something you perhaps think about or do indeed in Birmingham with those grumpy teenage boys who might not want to speak and might not want to speak in front of their mum either.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly something when we're talking about transition, the young people, whether they're boys or girls, get a chance to see the consultant on their own, excuse me, and ask those questions in preparation for transition to adult care. So it's certainly something we offer the young people, a chance to do that. And also to see the nurses on their own, and if they're injured, to see the doctor on their own.
Obviously, without naming names, have you got any examples of where that's been really beneficial for your patients?
Yeah, we had a little boy with moderate haemophilia come in with a scrotal injury, and he denied all knowledge of it, didn't know how he'd done it, but he didn't want everybody looking, so he just went in with the doctor and his mum. And, you know, normally if there's an injury, either myself or Katie, the other nurse, like to have a look so that we can, when they come back the next day, we can see if it's got any better, you know, if it's shrunk or anything. But on this particular occasion, because of where the injury was and his age, we didn't look. And we just relied on hopefully the next doctor seeing him the next day. And we had a young lady come in recently struggling with her periods, a Muslim young lady, and we got a female doctor to speak to her. So it's just sort of working around what we can and trying to meet their needs.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Natalie. I think that takes us to 10:02, so I think we are now on to our second aspect of this afternoon's talk on advocating for change. We will now be talking about how we as a community can come together to advocate for change, and we're going to hear from Jamie O'Hara from HCD Economics on the importance of data and how this can be used to make change. And then afterwards, we will hear from Lisa Steadman and Sandra Dodgson from HeemNet, with Hannah Yarnall, one of our youth ambassadors, about the Phoenix Project and how this will be used to influence change. So I think there might be a short interlude here just while we get Jamie to join us virtually. Hello. Oh, I can see your lips moving, Jamie. Try that one again. A little bit faintly. I think we're just going to adjust the volume.
Okay, excellent.
Perfect. We can hear you loud and clear, Jamie. Nice to see you.
Yeah, good to hear you, mate. I can see you on a different screen now. Yeah.
Move across.
Okay.
Are you able to just put your slides into presentation mode, please, Jamie, just to fill the screen a bit more? Perfect. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Oh, there's a lag on the link. This is really peculiar. Yeah. Okay. Apologies for not being able to be there today, and thanks very much for inviting me to speak. I know that we're quite far into the day, so I've got a job on my hands to make this subject interesting to some anyway, but I will do my best. So what I'm going to talk about today is data and why it's important. Here are some of my declarations. Got many hats, work with lots of different government agencies. I've had official roles and got sort of roles, technical roles in the UKHS, the EHCWFH. I've worked with lots of different companies and governments. And yeah, probably worth mentioning as well that I'm a patient too. So in terms of the content of this, sorry, just putting a stopwatch on. In terms of the content, we'll take a look at what data is and try to understand what it is and what forms it comes in. And then what we'll do is try to understand what it's for, why is it important? And then we'll take a moment to consider a UK Haemophilia Society initiative that I'm currently involved with, working with Clive and a former director of NICE. And then think about what achieving equity means. So this may seem like a difficult slide to incorporate, but this is in effect how the other side see data. So when we think of data and what's important to us, I thought it was really interesting listening to one of the many twins before. I know twins come in twos, but there seems to be bloody loads of pairs kicking around, talking about their particular outcomes and what's important to them. And these things are important. However, when we think about the data we captured and how it's articulated and what the quality of that data is, it's imperative that we understand what the other side of the equation requires. So in other words, the metrics that matter to us need to be articulated in a way that matter to decision makers and policy makers. And when we think about this in the context of evidence for access to treatments, the absolute gold standard is a systematic review of and meta-analysis of clinical trial results. And that is the gold standard. And just to be clear, you will never, ever be able to get hold of that in haemophilia because we're a rare disease group. And even within haemophilia itself, there are then subgroups. So we've got A, B, mild, moderate, severe, with inhibitor, without inhibitor, and different. And then it can become even more granular than that by how the trials are split out. So you'll never have enough data to give that gold standard. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So that's why when you're invited to take part in certain studies, it'll be around these cohort studies, case reports, background and expert opinion. That's why all of this is so important. So where do we get this? Where do we get data from? So we've already touched on it, and that hierarchy of evidence has given us an insight. But primarily, the big thing that we'll look at, and I heard Pratima talk earlier as well, is very much in the UK. We are very lucky to have the world's leading clinicians. So we've got people like Pratima, Dan Hart, Charlie Hay, Kath as well, who's in my centre. She's awesome, Kathy Fadley. So we are we're truly blessed with regards to the access to high levels of care, and not to mention our very own care actually as well. And many pivotal trials and trial designs and insights into how we capture data within these trials and what metrics matter are heavily listened to globally by from our physician and clinical community. So when we run our clinical trials, we get some of the best data, and we run a lot of them. And this gives us a good insight into, first of all, the safety of the treatment. And that's what the early phases are for, around the safety and efficacy. And then once we understand that a little bit more, we'll move into phase 3. And that's when we learn more about the safety and efficacy over a longer period in a bigger cohort, but we also seek to understand in more detail the incremental benefits of the treatment with regards to not just clinical, but also the quality of life for a patient. Because, you know, having a factor level of 25 versus 0 sounds great to a clinician or someone who understands exactly what this disease is. However, if you are a payer, what does that actually mean in terms of quality of life and improvement in the day-to-day life of a patient? The other one as well, and this has been mentioned a couple of times today, is the UKHCDO. So we can derive data from patient registers. I think that's the correct terminology. If Jerry Dolan's on, he will kick me if I tried to just use the term registries in a blanket way. But registers are effectively routinely collected data sets from within the provider setting that capture a homogeneous pro forma of data. So when you fill in your heme track, that's a fixed thing that everyone fills in the same, and it goes back into the UKHCDO. Equally, when you visit your centre, when they complete information on your resource use and your consultations and all those good things, that's then transposed into a CRF that then goes into this database. So we're pretty well off with regards to that. And we've probably got one of the best registries in the world, probably barring Australia, who are very competitive. I will get a rise out to someone for that. But yeah, in effect, we've got a very good registry. And then this is where it kind of people become important, like we as the patients become important. When we're thinking about real world data, when we look at real world data, what we do is we in effect get real insights from the patient journey, and that gives us it's a different way of capturing data more informally. So we can do this via direct chart reviews, interviews with patients, expert elicitations, discrete choice experiments, so on and so forth. And this is this is something that we've worked with the Haemophilia Society on quite a lot, and other groups do it as well. But these data are very important, because remember what I said at the top about clinical trials. This is usually the gold standard in disease areas like diabetes. You can get everything you want from a clinical trial, more or less, whereas in diseases like haemophilia, in particular the rare diseases, we certainly need to gain extra insight via more creative means. So real world data is very important. And I guess the important question is, what's it all for? And it's not, well, ultimately it's to avoid conflict, collision or confusion from one end or the other. So for the visual learners amongst us, I've found this nice picture on the internet of a car crashing through the wall in order to get the drugs that they feel that they need. There's no need to resort to that if you can understand each other, understand what each other's wants and needs are, and what metrics are important to either side, and how they need to be articulated for both parties to understand and move forward together. So it's a journey, and it's important, especially in a rare disease, to take pragmatic and collaborative approaches. So I think Clive in particular is an outstanding advocate, and we've got amazing people as well. Kind of Kate Bates, a rock star. I've met her a few times quite recently, and she's super ace. And we've got Kate Cahere, and all those good people who are around the community who do outstanding work in lobbying. And what we mean when we talk about lobbying is we we need, when we have a cause or an aim that we're trying to fulfill or influence, then we need to work in a smart way, not just shout because we want it sort of way. You've got to work in a smart way and together with all of the appropriate stakeholders, because it's sort of like trying to have a vote without people in the room. So when you work collaboratively with others and understand their stake in the game, then you can work together in order to obtain better outcomes. So you can produce messages with and for all of those important audiences, and you can look to influence, because we gain access for our drugs usually through the tender process. Pratima touched on it earlier about how NICE are looking at our assessments moving forward. However, there's a lot of precedent for decisions being made outside and negotiations taking place outside of the NICE setting as well. And we certainly, as a community and certainly as an entity, the UK Haemophilia Society should be part of that. So it's about ensuring that you work with the correct stakeholders, the correct people, and then are in a position to influence. The other reason, and to do that, obviously you need data, which is the whole point. And sorry, I should have said that. But with regards to standard of care as well, all of this matters. I thought some of the discussion before about physio and women with bleeding disorders as well, the standards of care seem to certainly be less consistent there than the provision that we have for men with bleeding disorders. And rightfully so. No, just trying to be contentious. Sorry, my wife's nearby, and Sonia, who's on the board. So yeah, sorry. But no, so in terms of understanding and trying to make provision for good standard of care right across the board, we need these data to be able to make the case and to help us understand, are there inconsistencies in the models of care across a healthcare setting? And if there are, where are the good ones? What rules of best practice should we be implementing horizontally right across the entire framework and right across the care pathways that are offered to our patients and would-be patients in the future? Because setting up the right processes is very important, and the best way to do that is via good data. And then the drug access processes, I've mentioned this quite a few times, and HTA is a very rigid process, and I've been involved in probably the best part of 50 to somewhere between 50 and 100 HTA submissions globally, many of them in the UK, and it's very rigid. We fall into a rare disease category, so not an ultra rare disease category. And that means that the expectation in the process may be mismatched by what's actually achievable in the data generation construct that's available to us. Like I say, we won't get the gold standard data from clinical trials. So again, just going back to here, it's very important that we work with the right stakeholders and take them on the journey so they understand what we can and cannot prove with regards to data. And this is, I think, I wanted to put this in because there was a project that was involved in a couple of years ago called Hercules, which was a Duchenne muscular dystrophy project, whereby they brought together government, policymakers, pharma, advocates, patients, physicians, all these wonderful stakeholders all together into a room and said, right, this is how the landscape looks. What do we need in order to be able to understand each other and be able to be in a position for fair and equitable decisions to be made when the HTA comes to pass? And it's a very good success. No drugs have gone through yet. However, NICE were there and certainly part of the process with regards to refining exactly what the what the body of work needed to look like and what the body of evidence needed to look like from a community perspective to ensure that their case was put forward properly. And we were approached by a number of pharmaceutical companies and also a former lead of rare disease reimbursement in NICE about running a project that's going to articulate this and in haemophilia. So together with the Haemophilia Society and delegates from the University of Chester, we'll be embarking on a project that looks at doing just what the Hercules project did, but for haemophilia. So we'll look at models of care, payment models, burden of illness, and the economic, and we'll build an economic model that's been verified by NICE before we actually go through the process. And then we'll look to disseminate it, and then obviously we'll be in a good strong position to advocate for better access moving forward. And just to finish, this is all all a fight to achieve this. We as a society, we tend to look for equity of outcome in a lot of places at the moment, and I think the most logical place to apply equity of outcome is healthcare. If we all pay into a system, and if you're born with a rare genetic bleeding disorder, you shouldn't be apologetic for it. It's kind of why we all pay into a social fund, as it were. And we should be looking for equitable outcome. And when those technologies are available, we should be working with the providers and the payers. And for that, we need data to do it. And that's what we're looking to achieve. But thanks very much for listening to my presentation.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Checks in the post for those nice comments. I can't believe you didn't mention Mike Macris as well when you mentioned leading clinicians, but I'll let that one slide.
Sorry, I love Mike Macris. He is one of my heroes, and I do follow him on Twitter.
I knew you'd be racked by guilt when you realised that you'd missed him out. And Jamie, I'm not sure I've ever seen a talk of yours that hasn't included that slide at the end, but like you, I love it, so I forgive you every time because I love to see it. So thank you for including that. I'd be disappointed now, I think, if you didn't include that slide. Jamie, we are a little bit ahead of schedule, so I'm just going to ask you a few questions before we move on to our next speakers. My first question is this, is how, we live in an era where you can't buy so much as a cup of coffee, really, without walking out and getting an email saying, how was your experience, etc. How good do you think we are as a community at communicating to patients what happens with their data? And I'm hoping you're going to say not very good. And if so, what can we do better to improve that?
Yeah, I will answer the question, but you're right. We are over surveyed for our personal experiences. I went to an airport for the first time the other day, and there was actually a press this button if you enjoyed the experience for the toilet. Yeah, so sorry, I'm moving away from that anyway. Yeah, when people take part in data collection activities, it's like when you go onto an Apple device or whatever, and then there's an 800 page war and peace on what's going to happen with your data and where it's going. And I don't think people who get contacted for studies, I don't think they're informed well enough about what the data is going to be used for. I fully agree with you. And I just think researchers and advocates, when you're engaging with the community, need to treat them like adults when you're working with an adult population, and be transparent and say, we're going to use this data in order to be able to better understand your situation, which will then become part of a composite data set that will then subsequently be used to advocate for X, Y, or Z, whether it be to lobby government for something, to go into an assumption in a health economic model for subsequent reimbursement. I just think being transparent with people is important, but removing the legalese aspect, which, Clive, you may or may not like.
Not. Thank you for that. And I'm not sure if this is a question really, but an observation really, and like to get your thoughts on it. I know, speaking to people like Brian O'Mahony in Ireland, they're looking at developing a patient portal. How do you think we can work towards doing something like that here? And what I'm thinking of here is something along the lines of, you already mentioned Haemtrack, for example, the fact we all go on there and log when we've injected and times, etc. But that data and information is not joined up with, for example, the delivery company who sends you your treatment. So rather than them having to phone you and saying, how much treatment have you got, they should know that if they've delivered 10 and you've recorded that you've used 7, you've got 3 left. Or you might, for example, be able to go onto the portal and book an appointment in the same way you can book a table for a restaurant. So where do you think we could be improving and going in that direction in the UK?
Yeah, I think that it can certainly be improved in the UK. I'd sort of caution against becoming too reliant on a system like that. I certainly think we need one. I don't know whether you've seen the Tesla app collapsed today, and there was people stood outside of the cars all over the world because they couldn't get in. So you know, these technologies, whilst they are fantastic, they're not necessarily a panacea. So I think the success that Ireland have had, and they are the most effective advocacy haemophilia organisation in the world with regards to their successes, and we've got definitely more talent. Brian's not in the room, so we can say it. We've definitely got more talent on our boards, or as much talent, and we can definitely do more. And I think getting a good, rigid database of our members and being able to separate them out by what sort of who they are, whether the carers, patients, or just people who are interested in the support in the community, and then being able to keep them informed and, like you say, link back to their treatment delivery company and all those good things. It's eminently achievable, and I think it's got to be the way forward, because if we want to be successful in our advocacy ambitions in the future, we need evidence, and the only way to draw evidence is to have access to the data. And I think that was my last slide, actually, and the patients are the data. And unless we work together and we contribute towards the things that we believe in collectively, we won't achieve the things we want to. And I think a portal is the first step in doing that.
Great. Thank you, Jamie. I think that's a good note to end on for there. But I say, stay with us because we've got the question and answer at the end. So we are now going to move over to Lisa Steadman and Sandra Dodgson from Haemophilia and Hannah Yarnall to talk about Project Phoenix.
I'm going to stand over here, even though I feel now like I'm trapped in a corner. This is quite strange. So Lisa, Hannah and myself are going to talk to you about Project Phoenix. Sorry, I always do that. That's why I usually have a radio mic. I'm basically picking up on what Jamie was saying there at the end and his last slide about the inequities. And we've heard a lot about that in the physio group. We hear a lot about it. There's something about that collective and the collaborative advocacy. So obviously Natalie and Josh have talked about kind of self-advocacy. Where we're moving into is that more collective. And so I'm just going to do very briefly about why we did Project Phoenix and what we were aiming to do with it. The lovely Lisa, who's going to kind of talk about what we did, and then Hannah is going to cover the lessons learned. We have 6 slides, so I just thought I'd give you that in advance, so you're not thinking, oh my word, we could be here for the next 3 hours and Clive will start panicking. So why did we do this? So if I move, it's that one, isn't it? Yep. So I think we heard this morning about, certainly in the physio group, was anybody in the physio group? So there's the peer review, and I think the APPG, and I think you mentioned them, Clive, this morning, didn't you? What we were looking at is there's a lot of analysis been done, but we want to build on it. And if we're looking at collective advocacy, and I think I've heard the theme in most of the sessions, it's people who bring about change. Whether that's in advocating for yourself, in advocating for your children, or by coming together, as Jamie was describing, to advocate kind of collectively. And we set out to say, well, we want to look at how do we build on those two pieces of work, plus lots of other things that are happening in bleeding disorder care, but shift into what do we do about it? How do we actually get the change? How do we get something to address those inequities? And in doing it, we wanted to engage the whole community. And so we actually worked with all 4 nations and deliberately kind of included that. And at the beginning of lockdown 1, we approached Clive and said, we're thinking of this, and we developed a proposal together, didn't we, to say, actually, again, stronger voice if we're doing this together rather than as kind of individuals. And we included the youth ambassadors as well, because they're key in terms of the kind of future. And what we did was create a collaborative steering group, and we had a broader reference group. And what I mean by a collaborative steering group is we had both patients, family members, we had doctors, nurses, physios, psychology, right through. But we didn't want to have it so big that you could never do anything. So we also then had a broader reference group that we talked to. So some of the people that you'll have connected with, whether that's, if as a woman, you might have had access to a gynecologist. You might have seen somebody in orthopedics around kind of joints, etc. And before I hand over to Lisa, what we wanted to do, as I say, is to identify what could be done and what action can we take beyond this. And in doing it, what we got was an incredible response from people, both clinically, from patients, from family members. And so I think before I hand over, I just want to kind of say on behalf of us that we really want to kind of thank everybody that has contributed so far and then will continue to contribute, because it is in that collective, it is in that strengthening of our collective voice that we can get something to happen. And we'll come back to what the happening is. So I'm going to hand that over to Lisa.
Rather than risk that one. Hello, everybody. Is that working? Do I have to hold it right? Brilliant. So thanks for having me along today and letting us share a little bit more about the project with you. Sandra's talked to you about the team that were behind the project, which was obviously really important in actually executing the project and making that happen. But I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about the rest of the people that helped make that project possible, because it really wouldn't have been possible if it wasn't for the generosity and the kindness of all the people we actually interviewed and that spoke up and gave their voice to the project. So we learned an incredible amount from them. I think it's probably fair to say we're slightly overwhelmed by the amount we've learned from them. Lots of work to do on that we're looking forward to still working with. But I just wanted to talk a bit about how we went about talking to people. So we kicked off with a survey that was shared across social media. It was shared by the NMOs. As Sandra said, we worked with all 4 nations. It was pushed out to healthcare practitioners as well, so using people like the HCPA, the HPA, the nurses groups. We wanted everybody to take part in that survey, not just for it to be a patient survey or a clinician survey. And we managed to achieve 350-ish responses from that survey. Lots of people then left their details for us to follow up. They had more to tell us. It was quite a short, brief survey, gave us lots of really interesting insight. But it was really also about identifying people that wanted to share a bit more with us as well. And we spoke to them through a number of qualitative conversations. So in-depth conversations, some of those were with individuals, some of those were in group discussions. So people that were able to come together as a group. Really, really interesting conversations, because you obviously get the shared conversation going on within those sessions as well. But we wanted to balance that with people that perhaps they didn't feel comfortable coming along and talking in a group. Perhaps they just had something that was a bit too raw and emotional to talk to us about and didn't want to talk in a group. But it also meant we could really follow their whole journey through. When you're talking just to one person at a time, you can follow their story right the way from as far back as they want to go, from diagnosis up until the sort of present day. We had over 100 conversations with clinicians, as Sandra said, from all specialisms and actually non-specialisms as well. We spoke to people that weren't just specialists in bleeding disorder care, but went beyond that. That was really important for us to make sure we captured those voices as well. We also spoke to a huge range, if you like, of patients as well. We didn't only talk to men, we spoke to women. We didn't only speak to people that actually lived with their own bleeding disorder. We spoke to parents as well, some of course who had their own bleeding disorder, some that didn't. We spoke to many people that had family histories and many people that had absolutely no family history at all, and the whole world of bleeding disorders was completely new to them. We spoke to people not just about their treatment and about their kind of physical care. We also spoke to them about the kind of psychosocial side of their care as well, and the impact that their bleeding disorder would have on that part of their life. We spoke to severe haemophiliacs, milds, moderates. We spoke to von Willebrand's type 1, 2, 3. We spoke to other ITP patients, all manner of bleeding disorders. We really tried to make sure this was as broad as possible and not just from the voice of one particular patient group, if you like. We also spoke to parents of children, and we spoke to people up into their sort of 70s, 80s, so had really had a very long life with a bleeding disorder and a very, very different perspective, as you can imagine. You know, we're talking to people that have had no treatment for most of their life, probably lived through the contaminated blood scandal, and then we're talking to people whose children have been put straight onto something like Haemophilia and have never even had to learn what a vein is. So really kind of broad range there as well. We also talked to them not only about their treatment, it was important to us to understand how their treatment was delivered to them and how they played a part. So Josh has talked earlier, we've heard about how important it is to have the patient involved in that as well. So it was really important to us to explore not only are you on the right treatment, how many bleeds are you having, that kind of stuff. It was important to us to understand, how do you actually feel about this? How's it impacting on your life? And as I said, not only consultants and nurses, we were also talking to all sorts of non-specialist areas as well, not only including sort of gynecology, physiotherapy. We spoke to dentists, podiatrists, we spoke to lab technicians, really important part of the process, very much behind the scenes, don't often get to see them, but really important. And lastly, I just wanted to say that in terms of the sort of breadth of the conversations we had, I think something that really stuck out to us was not only did we learn about the questions we were asking, we were learning about our community as a bunch of people as well. And we really learned about the resilience of those people, the strength of those people, and I think how much they want to work together. You know, I think it's easy sometimes, isn't it, when perhaps a consultant appointment doesn't go as well as you might have wanted it to, or you feel like you've not quite got the treatment that you wanted in A&E. You know, it's easy to think that maybe not everybody's on your side as a patient, and that absolutely through this research we found that very much this community wants to work together and largely does a really good job of working together. We uncovered lots of examples where that working together is working really well. We also know, so I mentioned about the resilience of the community that we spoke to. Some of the people we spoke to had never spoken to somebody about their bleeding disorder before. They'd never had somebody to share their story with. And partly that was because some of the people hadn't even actually been diagnosed. They were always coming to us to say, I'm sure I've got a bleeding disorder. I just don't know what it is, and we haven't had it diagnosed yet. So some of them were talking for the first time. Some of them were meeting others for the first time. In some of the groups we ran, particularly with the women, there'd be women there that had never met another woman with a bleeding disorder and had never heard that actually what they were living with and experiencing was not in isolation. There were other women living with that as well. So it was really important for us to hear those stories. And see that support coming through. Again, when people spoke together in a group to see how they supported each other and could support one another, offer their own support with the experience and knowledge that they have. So yeah, the conversations we had, I mean, they were often emotional. There were tears, my own included, I have to say. Some of the stories were people have had real challenges that they wanted to share with us. It was a very emotional, very inspiring, very heartfelt conversations from the people that took part, very honest and engaging. And I think most of all, really thought-provoking. It's left us with a lot of things to think about, a lot of things that we want to continue working on, both from the point of view of representing patients and from the point of view of the clinicians as well. So that was a bit about how we actually went about the research. I'm going to hand over to Hannah, who will share a bit about some of our findings.
Thank you. Please bear with me. I'm not used to standing in front of people. I'm used to a headset and a computer screen. So this is quite new to me. I also feel like I'm going to do karaoke with this microphone, but don't worry. I'm not going to sing. Definitely not had enough to drink yet. So key learnings. Some of the key learnings might not be a surprise to you guys. One of them is that... Oh, sorry. Thank you. Patients don't always know what care they can ask for. Some centres offer different services, some offer different treatment options, and not everyone knew what they could ask for, what was available to them. Another thing as well is that it can be quite hard to raise those conversations and ask those questions. It takes sort of like a certain skill or confidence in doing that. Obviously, we heard about Josh earlier saying that what treatment was correct for him, but some people felt that they didn't have those skills to sort of start those conversations. But I have this a lot when I do events for the Society, and I see it a lot, is people are really good at advocating for others. I think it can be quite difficult to advocate for yourself. Recently at work, we were discussing about personal brands and how you can sort of sell yourself. And I've personally found it a lot easier to talk to my friends and say, what do you think, and have that conversations. And like Lisa mentioned earlier, those workshops, we did have people that were almost advocating for other people they've never met in those groups. So it's just really great how people can sort of get together, share their experiences, and then other people were sort of there to provide their own experiences, their own support and guidance to say, this is what I've done previously, so why don't you give that a go? And it's that kind of support that I think people thrive off, that peer support really. And then just to go on from that, I think some of the key areas we spoke about were advocacy, education and communication, sort of the three key areas of what people sort of say that they are almost missing, and we really appreciate having that, like I said, that support to advocate for themselves. And then finally, my bit's really quick, don't worry. Finally, there's already great stuff happening. So as Lisa said, that we were speaking to people from all different areas. Great work is already happening. They just need the time and resources to help it succeed. And that is my quick bit over and done with. So yes, I'll hand back to Lisa. Oh, which way? Thank you.
I'm going back in the corner. So, I'm going to have to stand out here. You know when you feel trapped, you can't think? So, one of the things that we said right from the outset is we didn't want to produce another report. Very early on, when we were talking to some of the steering group members, it was great as a clinician, so a couple of the doctors, great as a clinician to receive my peer review report, but it's like this thick. And I'm busy, and it's really important that I read it, but what nobody actually told me, what does this mean in terms of what I need to do with my trust in order to get the services that I need? Because actually that's not the skill that they come to work with. It's back to, we all have different skills that we kind of bring. So what we want to do is to look forward in terms of kind of action. And we, as Lisa said, we heard a lot. And we want to try and share it in usable chunks, things that will actually make a difference. So some of the stories that Lisa was describing and Hannah was saying we heard in the group, we're taking those and creating animations that get that message across in a short but much more interesting way than 3 or 4 pages of written script. We've also, you'll see that's the beginning of the infographic, and we're going to be sharing that with everybody that responded to the survey, because it's the other thing that Clive held us to account with in doing this. And I think Jamie mentioned it as well, didn't it? We get surveyed a lot as a community. Actually, what we need to do is give you the feedback in terms of what we heard and what we're doing with it. So this will be the starting point for that. And there's lots of very interesting conversations going on between web designers and infographic people in a language I don't understand, but I know somewhere between them they'll create the thing that we want to kind of create that'll be useful. We're also going to be doing some of the kind of podcasts, various things in terms of Haemcast, that we've got a place to locate it. We also want to kind of do things that would be continuing pieces of work beyond this. What this has really done is given us a start point. It's brought together people. And as I said at the beginning, it's people that actually make change. And the more of us together, the more we can do. So, final slide. So, relating this back to advocacy and about addressing the inequities, which was our title. So, we talked about self-advocacy. So, Natalie, Josh, again. Lisa's kind of raised that in terms of kind of what we heard for people who were advocating for themselves, but also advocating for others. And the bottom one, I've used the word mutual in there because I couldn't get collaborative in without it making it so small you'd never have been able to see it. And when we look to what Paul Sartain was saying in the physio session earlier, so he was talking about the strength of voice of local groups. So there's lots of examples that we've gathered of where people have actually achieved things by doing things together, and that's what we want to start sharing, because you can learn from how others have achieved it. And also in terms of, Jamie was talking about lobbying, wasn't he? He had that kind of picture where you have to get the people in the room, the stakeholders together. And some of what we want to do beyond is actually about that. It's about where do we take action. And where Hannah mentioned, to give you an example, where Hannah mentioned the not knowing what you can ask for, what are you entitled to? It came up, didn't it, as a kind of key theme in what we were kind of discussing. So you've got something called the National Service Specification that tells the centres this is what you should be providing. It's quite a nice weighty tome. Well, it's not actually that great, but it's kind of lots of detail. What does that mean for you? What does it mean that you can go and say, I am entitled to have this service? And we heard from sort of many people who said, I didn't know I could have access to physio. And yet it says you should have access to physio. So that helps you with the self-advocacy, doesn't it? But then there's something about having the confidence, being a Josh, and actually having that kind of way of addressing it with your clinician. I'm sure you used to do that, didn't you, Clive? And I'm sure others of you have done it for your families. So I think what I'd like to kind of close with is I think it's the power of that collective advocacy. Does that make sense to you? Have you been or seen any kind of examples? Or have we put you to sleep? No, there is something really, really important in what we believe we've started to do, is to start to kind of move down that kind of route, and we've got to build on it. I think that covers everything. Does that cover everything, Lisa? Hannah? Okay. Did we
Thank
do
you
it in
very
time,
much.
Clive?
You are. We're back on track now. So we will leave any questions to the end. So we have 15 minutes at the end for questions and answers. So we are going to finish this afternoon's session of speakers with another one of our fantastic youth ambassadors, Jess Page. So Jess, over to you.
Hello. I'm Jess. I am one of the youth ambassadors for the Haemophilia Society. I am also a woman with a bleeding disorder. I have both haemophilia and low 1 milligram factor as well, because why have one when you can have two? And I want to talk to you a little bit about the work that I've been doing and some of the others have been doing as advocacy work within the society. Definitely, I think one of our big successes this year is the work that we've been doing with the Women's Working Group. The Women's Working Group is just a collection of women, all connected with bleeding disorders in some way. So some of us actually have bleeding disorders, including some of the rarer, kind of less heard of bleeding disorders, and some people are professionals that work within the community. And we meet regularly kind of to discuss kind of topical, relevant issues, and primarily, as we've kind of already talked about so far today, how we can raise awareness of bleeding disorders in women, both within our community and with outside the community as well, and how we can improve access to treatment for women. And only just this week, we launched the Talking Red's Symptom Tracker tool, which is like this online quiz, like a survey, another survey that women can take. That's about, it identifies some of the kind of symptoms that you might have as a woman with a bleeding disorder, and not just things like heavy periods. It also talks about that easy bruising as well, and the nosebleeds and things like that. It kind of then emails them a result about whether or not that their collection of symptoms might identify that they have some kind of bleeding disorder, and it gives them the information that they need to then have that productive conversation with their GP or other medical professional. And we're hoping that will really help raise awareness kind of more externally and help kind of identify some of those women that need that diagnosis, because ultimately, if you haven't got a diagnosis, then it's going to be more difficult to access that treatment. In addition to that, something else that we've been doing is we've been planning our next Talking Red event. As Clive mentioned earlier, unfortunately, the last Talking Red event was cancelled right at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. So we're really excited to be meeting up again. And without sounding really cheesy, we're hoping it's going to be the best one yet. And the whole point of the Talking Red campaign is to raise awareness of women with bleeding disorders and to kind of also enable women to advocate for themselves, because there is such a misconception of what a bleeding disorder might look like in women, even kind of within the women themselves. So it's about giving people the information that they need to be empowered to kind of have those conversations with their centre. In addition, like I said, I am a youth ambassador, and we all have bleeding disorders ourselves. We often support the Haemophilia Society in lots of different ways. Sometimes it's practically, like we've been helping out today, or at youth camp and stuff like that. But one of the big things that we do is, because we all have bleeding disorders, we can help advocate for members of the community. Sometimes that's kind of more external, and the things that we do kind of in the outside world. So, for example, you might have seen over the last couple of weeks a video that's made its way around on Facebook and lots of social media of Matty, which is one of the youth ambassadors. He's hiding at the moment, I can't find him. And a mate of his going around in a Zorb ball, like one of those giant inflatable balls, but it's definitely worth a watch. It's hilarious, just trying to watch his mate like in this Zorb ball, try and get inside this taxi. That alone is worth watching it. But that, again, that's gone out into just the general public, and part of that is to raise awareness of bleeding disorders and what bleeding disorders are, but also to kind of break down that misconception, both inside and outside the community, that people with bleeding disorders need to be wrapped up in cotton wool and they need to be protected, which, as we've talked about a lot today, just isn't the case. I recently did an article with the Farmer Times, and I talked about my experiences as a woman with a bleeding disorder and just some of the difficulties that that can crop up as well. And we've done all sorts of things, like things with the APPG and stuff like that. But I think a lot of our favourite events is the Newly Diagnosed Weekend, which, as you guys know, is for people that have just had a diagnosis of a bleeding disorder. And we meet families there and we talk to them about our experiences and things like that. And one of the things we've started trying to do over the last couple is, obviously, if you've got a room full of women that have children with bleeding disorders, chances are you've got a room full of women that are carriers of these bleeding disorders. And we've been trying to use those sessions to talk to them about some of the bleeding issues that they might have had as well in their lives. And it's really interesting talking to them and saying, well, you guys might have bleeding disorders too, and talking about some of the symptoms that they may have had. And you can just see their faces light up, like, oh my gosh, I didn't realise that, wow, I always had problems with heavy periods and bruising and stuff like that, but not actually making the connection that that could be because themselves have that bleeding disorder. We've also done a lot of training as youth ambassadors to give us lots of different skills and things. And I was really, really lucky that I got to be part of the EHC's youth training. It was a while ago now. Again, that was supposed to be in person, but it was just happened just after the COVID pandemic. So it was all happened virtual. So unfortunately, I didn't get my trip to Amsterdam that I was after, so I still need to visit there. But that was really fantastic because that gave me a lot more information about how kind of like haemophilia societies around the world work, how medicines can kind of come to fruition, which is the sort of stuff that Jamie was talking about earlier. And then I was lucky enough, again, to be selected after that to take part in the EHC's debate. And it's something that happens annually, and it's some people from the youth training get paired up and they get given a topic that they have to debate about, and it's usually very topical at the time. So the year that I took part, one of the questions was about telemedicine, because obviously now that we were in a pandemic, everyone was having to do their appointments online, and they were arguing whether or not that was effective. And the statement I was given was, in von Willebrand's disease, are men with von Willebrand's disease being left behind? Now, as a woman with a bleeding disorder, I spend most of my life trying to convince people that women are being left behind. So actually, it was really difficult to kind of change my mindset and delve deeper into that and to see whether or not I believe that could be the case. And I had to argue that men had been left behind, and my counterpart had to argue that they didn't. We were paired up with mentors to kind of to develop our own understanding, and I found that really interesting because it wasn't something I'd ever really looked at before. And it opened my eyes to kind of see that actually there are still pockets within the community of things that we haven't really talked about and things that we haven't really explored. And that presentation, it was really interesting to be with a lot of different people over Zoom, and to be able to explore those different themes and listen to different people's opinions. And the cherry on the cake is that I was voted to have the most persuasive argument, obviously. As well as doing stuff with EHC, I've also done a few presentations with the WFH. The first one that I did was about how COVID had impacted different countries around the world in terms of accessing treatment and things like that. And it's always really interesting whenever you meet up with different communities around the world and how actually we're very lucky in the UK in the treatment and the access to treatment that we have. And so we spoke about how we as a society had changed the things that we'd done, and we'd started our Bleeding Matters live events and things like that as a response to just not being able to meet up face to face like some of us have been able to today. And then just recently I spoke at the youth training event that happened earlier about how it was a women's group, women and girls with bleeding disorders, and we talked about, it was a youth panel, and we talked about some of the things that we'd experienced in our life, even within our community, about the misconceptions that people might have and things like that. And I think it's been really interesting for me over the last year to come to the conclusion that actually, even within the community, even within us as a charity, even with people with bleeding disorders, there's still so much advocacy work to be done before we even kind of look at externally as well, which obviously we know there's a lot more work to be done there. But there are so many ways for people to get involved, whether it's kind of advocating for yourself when you're talking to your consultant and things like that, or even just kind of when you're talking to family and friends, the advocacy work that you can do. And obviously here at the Haemophilia Society, there are a lot of opportunities for people to take advantage of and to be a part of wider things, whether that's part of the local group or more. There's always more for you guys to do if there's stuff that you want to get involved with. But yeah, I'm so grateful for the opportunities that I've had to talk about things that are important to me and to raise awareness of bleeding disorders and the difficulties that people can experience with them. And that is all thanks to the Haemophilia Society.
Thank you, Jess. That was fascinating as always, and you're very humble in the sense that you didn't mention as well that for the EHC, that not only was your debate the best, but you were also selected as one of the top 4 within the 15 who attended out of Europe as well. It wasn't just a random selection.
I didn't want to brag.
I'm happy to brag for you, Jess. Equally, I should say, I hope Jess doesn't mind me saying this, but you've been very public about sharing this on social media and in your Ask in the Farmer Times. But Jess mentioned at the outset about her diagnosis of having both haemophilia and von Willebrand's disease. That second part of her diagnosis has only come very recently in the last 12 months. And Jess has tweeted about that, and it's been frustrating, certainly personally, just listening and seeing Jess tweet about that. That she's had to fight so hard to get that second part of her diagnosis. But equally, on the other hand, it's been incredibly inspiring to watch a young woman fight for what she's entitled to and to get to where she is now. And I also think there's somewhat of a symmetry and an irony looking at the panel today, because on the one side, we see Natalie, who said earlier that you can do any sport, just don't ask to play contact rugby. On the other end, bookended, is Jessica, who plays contact rugby. What a lovely symmetry to finish with. But I also just wanted to add one further point. We've got just over 10 minutes for questions and answers, but I just wanted to add a very, very brief example of something that I heard about earlier on this year, which I think is a fantastic example of self-advocacy. And it's around the COVID-19 vaccine. Of course, if we were to go back 2 years or so and we were to start to talk about intramuscular injections for people with bleeding disorders, we all would have started shaking our heads and getting very nervous and very worried and very panicked. Of course, along comes the vaccine, and all of a sudden we have to reassess what we thought was the considered position in relation to that for people with bleeding disorders. As a consequence of that, of course, the World Federation of Haemophilia and the European Haemophilia Consortium put together a guideline and guidance in relation to people with bleeding disorders having the COVID-19 vaccine, and broadly saying that, of course, if you've got a severe bleeding disorder, as long as you've treated, there's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't have the vaccine. Well, bearing that in mind, one of our trustees earlier on this year went to get her COVID-19 vaccine. As you'll all know, I'm sure, that when you go to get your vaccine, there is a list of questions they go through, one of them being, do you have a bleeding disorder? They got to that question and they said to this lady, do you have a bleeding disorder? And she said, of course, yes. At which point they all got very nervous and very twitchy and said to her, well, I don't think we're going to allow you to have it then. Cue about half an hour of panic while people went off and did various different things to see whether or not she could have it and speak to various doctors, etc. This person, instead of waiting for them to come back and tell her what happened, went online, found the WFH and EHC guidance about people with bleeding disorders having the vaccine, showed it to the people at the vaccination centre, and she was promptly given the vaccine. And I think that's a really, really good example of something very current and something very effective, that there was a lady who was empowered, who was very knowledgeable, and was able to advocate on her behalf. Otherwise, she could easily that day have been turned away and had to come back on another occasion to get that. So I think that ties in very nicely with what we've been talking about today. That's probably enough of me talking, not just now, but today generally. I don't know if we've got any questions. I know if there were any online, they were going to be sent to me. I'm seeing a shake of the back of the head. I've been checking my phone, but not had any passed on to me. Does anybody in the room have any questions they would like to ask, any points they would like to raise, any comments they would like to add? Do any of our panellists and speakers have anything they like to say or like to add? Lisa, what was the most surprising thing to come out of Project Phoenix for you? What did you not expect?
think for me, it wasn't just about what we learned about their experience of their healthcare and what was working and what wasn't working. It was about the community coming together. I guess I just hadn't really anticipated that there would be people that had never shared their story before, had never spoken to somebody, had never met somebody. And yeah, just that, like I said, the resilience of those people that we spoke to, that they do advocate for themselves as best they can. But I think that's not always as good as it could be. I think there's definitely room for improvement about that. And I guess I don't, anyone that's ever, I mean, I have a 16-year-old son with haemophilia, and I've had to advocate for him quite a lot over the years. And I think most people that I've come up against that I've had to advocate for him will know that I don't take no for an answer. I'm fairly kind of insistent. Don't like to let opportunities pass if I think that we can improve the situation we're in, and we feel very fortunate that we've got a really good team that look after us in that way. But I think there's a lot of people that don't know how to do that, and could really benefit from, I don't know, some people are just that kind of person, aren't they? I've not had training, I'm just that kind of person. I like to try and, fight for the cause when there's opportunity to. And I think learning that there's people that don't know how to do that, and also actually learning that sometimes the clinicians don't know how to do that as well. I don't think that's just a patient thing. I think there's clinicians that are really trying their hardest to fight for the things that we deserve as patients and parents of patients. And sometimes they feel that they're struggling to get their voices heard or their thoughts across to the right people in the right way. So I don't think that learning was just from a patient point of view. I think it was from the clinicians as well. So it's been interesting to hear about examples of advocacy, because I think there's more that can be done in supporting people and being able to advocate for themselves.
Josh, if you'd like to add anything.
Yeah, my big surprise working on Phoenix was actually watching the penny drop when on these group talks someone would think, oh, I'm not the only one with this views. So I haven't advocated for X, Y, or C because I thought I'm the only one with this point of view. And then as soon as you get a room full of mums or dads or physios, etc., start talking about the same issues that they've got or wants and needs that they would like changing, they're like, oh yeah, that's the same as me, that's the same as me. And then collectively just seeing the penny drop and they're like, right, let's do something about it, rather than sit indoors and do nothing because they think they're the odd one out. So that was quite interesting seeing that.
I suppose the power of that is that they've all arrived at that conclusion independently of each other as well. And it's only when they've shared it they've realised that they're all in the same boat.
Yeah, and it's like watching a domino effect. Like, oh yeah.
Hannah, and what about you, Project Phoenix?
Thank you. I think mine would be expanding my knowledge as well. There was quite a few people that we'd spoken to that I've never had one-on-one contact with before, and quite a few rare bleeding disorders that I'd never heard of before, which amazed me. So, and the most shocking thing for me was one lady who had never spoken to or never been to see a consultant at all. She just basically put her head down and got on with it, which is not really that uncommon for most sort of women, especially with bleeding disorders. They sort of take the focus off themselves. So yeah, I think that was the biggest learning for me. Was learning about those new conditions and sort of meeting people that had never gone and spoken to anyone. So, yeah.
Sandra, question for you then. As you and I both know, the Quality Review Service report, when it talked about overall themes, as you know, we surveyed 37 centres all around the UK, and the two big themes that came out of that were the lack of psychological support and the lack of physiotherapy support across the UK. Were those conclusions reinforced by what you saw in Project Phoenix, and what other, if any, themes emerged from your analysis?
Well, we haven't finished the analysis yet, is what I'd say. But yeah, I think what we did, what we heard, reinforced what came out of the QRS. But also what we did was go beyond that to hear about the things that are being done to address it. So it wasn't just about, yes, there's a problem in terms of inequity in physio, there's a significant problem in terms of inequity in access to psychological support. We talked, didn't we, Lisa, with the Haemophilia Psychological Association, and they've created a framework that if it was implemented and clinicians were supported to be able to use it and do it, would make a huge difference, because a lot of it's about well-being and about living well. So that was kind of where the psychological support broadened beyond what you might kind of traditionally think of, and was very much about how do we, and I think fits with what Kate was saying earlier about the rebranding. How do we live well with a bleeding disorder? Can we be supported to really live well? And a lot of the clinicians, I mean, Natalie, you kind of described some of kind of what you do around advocacy, the amount of advocating for individuals that clinicians do. So nurses, physios where they exist, etc. Yeah.
The nurses take on so much more than just being a nurse. I think you could agree with that. They're at the front end of everything, aren't they? They're the ones that you phone when you're having a hard time. They're the ones you phone when you first have a bleed. They're the ones that normally pop into A&E when you're sitting there and nobody knows what you're talking about. And like I was saying just now about the clinicians sometimes struggling to be able to always do their best in delivering what they want to deliver. We've had nurses talk to us about that they're not trained to be psychologists as well, but they're having to be psychologists as well. They're definitely not trained to be social workers, but they're delivering the service of being a social worker. And it's when, as Josh said, when people realise that actually I probably should have access to a psychologist, how do I go about getting that, rather than having to lean on my nurse who's absolutely doing her best and is definitely better than nothing, but on both sides knows that that's not really the right route to get that care. So yeah, just I think there was a huge amount of respect for a lot of the clinicians that are doing more than they, the physios as well. A lot of the one of the things the physios love about the work they do is that they can often get to work with patients long term, and they will have an hour with the patient, not 15-20 minutes in clinic. And they get to have those conversations with them that, again, there's a kind of the psychosocial kind of conversations and the support that people are looking for, but they're being had with the physiotherapist as well. So how do they support the best they can? Because they're in the right place at the right time, in the right environment to have those conversations, but again, not necessarily always equipped to have them. So yeah, it is about kind of upskilling everybody somehow. I don't know, it's something we're still looking at, but
I think it's partly upskilling, but it's actually freeing people up to do what they want to do, because the overriding kind of thing that as HeemNet we kind of, in terms of supporting the clinical teams, is actually, and it was reinforced in Phoenix, is that the number of clinicians who really want to make the service change, they want to go and get that physio support, they want to go and make those things happen. But the reality is a lot of them are doing it in their own time beyond work.
yeah. A lot of the joint clinics we heard about were a consultant would realise, actually I'm getting quite a few women coming to our clinic at the moment, and I don't really know much about that because I've not dealt with it before. But I know there's a great consultant down the corridor who's a gynaecologist. Let's get them in and literally off their own back, using their own time with no funding, no extra time, putting clinics in place. We saw it with podiatry as well, didn't we? Putting clinics in place to try and support each other's learnings as clinicians to better understand patients and be able to deliver those services, but without the funding there.
Yeah, and I think that's back to what I was trying to kind of say about the collective voice, because it's in individual centres where the teams are working together. We saw some brilliant examples where there was the potential. So one of the centres has got occupational therapy. It's in a different, it's in Ireland, so it's in a different environment. But that thing about what, as a community, with the society, with the individual national NMOs, with yourselves, with the clinical teams, with the likes of John Hanley was talking about physiotherapy this morning, that real wanting to make something happen. Things can happen and things will change, but we can do things further and faster if we focus on particular areas and do it together. Because it's that thing about an individual shouts and is heard by the people around them. But if you've got 40 individuals shouting about the same thing, something else happens, doesn't it? And you would have seen that in the AHC kind of training that you did. And the fact that, so that's the potential. It's small steps, but the reality is we can, by doing it together, make things happen that are actually about what people want.
Thank you, Sandra. I think that's a good note to finish on. Thank you very much. I think we're just a minute or two after 5. I think everybody's coming back in here now for the last 20 minutes, just for the last wrap-up. But before that happens, I just want to say thank you, Josh and ladies. Thank you very much all for your time this afternoon. That's been absolutely fascinating. And I hope you've enjoyed today. And any questions, please feel free to come and speak to anyone on the panel. So thank you, everyone.